Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about a very serious subject, and that is how can we reduce the number of school shootings that we're experiencing all too often in our society today. My guest today is Dr. William Jeynes. Dr. Jeynes is a professor of education. Welcome, Bill, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I should inform the audience before we begin the discussion that you have written a book about this very topic, reducing school shootings. And the book is a very comprehensive overview of the topic. You did meta-analysis, a lot of data collection, and formed some conclusions. So the first question will be, your conclusion, your main conclusion was that this is a very complicated and complex problem, and there isn't one simple solution to stopping school shootings. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of different approaches. How did the data that you collected lead you to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, let me explain to the listening and watching audience what a meta-analysis is, because probably most people who are watching don't know. And if you don't know, guess what? Don't feel badly. You are in the majority. And what a meta-analysis is you combine all of the studies that have ever been done on a particular topic, in this case, reducing school shootings, to see what the overall body of research indicates. So the findings are not based on my opinion. They are based on running meta-analyses and other analyses to see what factors contribute to reducing school shootings. So what I did is I fed some of the main categories of potential solutions into the meta-analysis, and the results indicate that we need a comprehensive approach to solving this problem. And it's very interesting, out of all the factors that I included in the meta-analysis, there is not even one that alone can solve this problem. However, when many factors are combined into one overwhelming strategy, hopefully, then we can bring down the number and severity of school shootings.
We're going to go through the list, or a list of specific conclusions that you came to and suggestions and even directives that you've offered in the book. We'll start with a couple that are really important, and in your final conclusion, you mentioned this and provided a lot of emphasis to these 2 points, and that is that this is something that is going to involve a lot of parental involvement. Now, it may seem obvious, but we're going to talk about that in more detail. Also, the schools have a role to play themselves in terms of what we used to call character education, and reintroducing character education, which is teaching students not just the numbers and reading and writing and arithmetic and that sort of thing, but also what it means to be a productive, honest person with integrity and someone who can handle disputes without going off the deep end. And so to ask you about those 2 conclusions, first of all, how do the parents, there are a lot of parents, we need to stipulate, a lot of parents today are very involved with their children and with their children's education, but there are some that aren't. And we'll talk more about that later. But how do parents figure into this equation first? And then secondly, what about the schools teaching character? How can they reintroduce that into the curriculum?
Well, I think it's good to begin by quoting Joseph Lieberman, who we might remember was a senator from Connecticut and then ran for the vice presidency, so a very well-respected politician. And he said, it all begins in the home. And we need to realize that. I think it's very easy many times to think, well, let the government solve the problems. But in reality, it begins with the home, and children need a loving and supportive environment, but also a structured environment. There needs to be a balance. And in fact, also to quote another very well-known psychologist who's passed on, but very well respected, Uri Bronfenbrenner out of Cornell, he said, what's necessary for children to thrive in the long haul is they need at least one parent who's crazy about them. So children need that support, and as you mentioned, schools also need to be supporting students, and we can talk about character in the schools in a way that you don't have to get religious about it. There's just certain qualities that almost everyone, unless they're a sociopath, they believe in, like love, honesty, compassion, showing respect, responsibility, and so forth. And these are the qualities that we should be teaching.
Well, since you mentioned religion, that's my next question, and that is, because you put a lot of emphasis on history and the history of education, and you noticed through the data analysis that school shootings seem to increase starting in the 1960s, and you have tied this through the research to a couple of Supreme Court rulings about religion, and that was about school prayer. Now, there are a couple of early 60s decisions by the Supreme Court where they determined that prayer would be taken out of school, at least in a formal way, and also that has resulted in basically schools not talking about religion at all. And the Supreme Court, according to what you wrote, didn't necessarily intend for all discussion of religion to go away. They just wanted to make sure there wasn't a structured prayer that was emphasized by one particular religious group. So, having said that, how did you come to this conclusion that those rulings by the Supreme Court were really kind of the beginning of this upsurge in school shootings?
Well, first of all, you have a lot of statistics indicating that such things as sex outside of marriage and violence surged immediately in 1963. In fact, Japan experienced much the same thing when they took moral education out of the schools, but they quickly inserted it back in, realizing that. But I'm not the only one to recognize that. Bill Clinton recognized it and said, you know what, the Supreme Court did not intend to take religion out of the schools to the place where if you're a student, you have to leave your faith at the front door of the school. And so in 1995, he made a speech in Virginia and said, we're going to put together some guidelines that teachers can use regarding what is permissible religious expression and what is not permissible. And that's been updated by a couple of presidents since then. But basically, that supplies the guidelines regarding what is permissible and what is not in the schools. And it shouldn't be that we as the public schools and the Supreme Court did not intend for people to think, oh, well, I can't say anything about my faith or what have you in the schools. In fact, the Supreme Court in the Abington decision actually said, for example, the Bible should be studied in the schools as long as it is part of a secular curriculum.
And also in terms of the concept of prayer, a lot of people have evolved the concept to mean a moment of silence or a moment of mindfulness. And how can we institute the moment of mindfulness or prayer, as long as it's silent, and also introduce some of those discussions about moral values that you just mentioned? How can we do that in a framework so that it doesn't violate the constitutional rights of atheists or agnostics or people of differing faiths?
Well, again, I think the Clinton guidelines, or at least those that were started with him, give teachers guidance. Obviously, a teacher cannot say, okay, pray during this period of time. However, moment of silence, and the teachers can give some options. You can reflect is one word that is used. You can pray, just by giving some options, and then the students can do whatever they and their parents feel comfortable with. And then what is helpful is that it's an accepting environment, meaning it's understood that you can do any number of things during this time, but also it doesn't deny or diminish the spiritual dimension that is clear in human beings overall.
And speaking of the spiritual dimension, you point out in the book that religious schools and parochial schools have fewer incidents of violence. They seem to have better racial harmony amongst differing racial groups, even in a very diverse school population. And also they don't have as many concerns about gun violence on campus. So what does that tell us about the value or the benefit of a religious belief system and allowing students to pray in school?
Well, of course, Christianity and other religions as well emphasize qualities such as love, which has become a four-letter word in our society. Now, don't worry about me. I do realize it's a four-letter word. But a lot of academics, for example, my goodness, nothing will get me in trouble more than talking about love, which many regard as anti-intellectual. But with Christianity in particular, we think of love and forgiveness many times as the central beliefs of the faith. And if we emphasize compassion, if we emphasize love, suddenly differences tend to be pushed to the side, and we focus also on our similarities.
Well, if we go back to family structure and families in general, this really is the root. You mentioned that earlier, that this is the root of character development. The home is the place where values are learned, or it's where dysfunctionality really makes things go awry. Now, we know that, according to the studies, many of these shooters, school shooters, come from homes that have experienced a lot of family trauma. This could be abusive parents, a single parent who's an alcoholic or a drug addict, perhaps a parent that's mentally ill. And we also have, frankly, some issues with a lot of fatherless children, boys in particular, who need a role model and just don't have one. And so the trauma in particular is problematic. So if the parents or single parent are unable to address this dysfunctionality, or maybe are unwilling to do it, how can and who can step in to correct the situation before it turns violent?
Well, there are other institutions, clearly, and I think a first step for other institutions such as the schools, such as community centers, such as boys and girls clubs and whatever, to step up to the plate. I think the first step we need to take is to acknowledge what you just shared. It really is undeniable. Again, I'm a data-driven guy. This is my emphasis, doing meta-analyses, and I get invited to speak for the US government and so forth, doing these meta-analyses. And CNN in 2017 came out with a list of the worst shootings, not just school shootings, but the worst shootings in recent American history, 27 of them. And further analysis was done of these shootings in 2019, and the conclusion was that 26 of the 27, the shooters came either from a single-parent family, were orphans, or a dysfunctional family, and so forth. So I think in order for these institutions to step up to the plate and realize that they can and they must help out, that needs to be acknowledged, and then again to realize that, okay, schools and other institutions cannot replace the parents, but they can serve as surrogate parents.
And we also know from the studies that you mentioned in the book, about 49 or 50% of school shooters have some absolutely serious mental illness. Now, this could be psychotic issues, or it could be that they have sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies. And oftentimes those are exhibited and people know about them. So how can we do a much better job of identifying those behavioral problems and then directing those individuals to the right care or to have the appropriate administrative actions take place?
I think we'll be more likely in the schools or wherever these children are located to do this if we first agree on the necessity of having an approach that is designed to benefit both the potential shooter and also the potential victims. And the problem we have so many times is one or the other tends to be emphasized. For example, at the Virginia Tech shooting, 32 passed, 32 were killed, but there were warning signs all over the place. But the university appeared to be more interested in protecting the rights and privacy of the potential shooter who was exhibiting threatening behavior than the people that he was threatening. And then after that, once we do that, then I think we need to be more comfortable as a society to identify what, and I hate to use this word because people don't like it anymore, abnormal behavior. We don't like that. We feel it's judgmental, but I would argue actually that we are doing a disservice both to the person who needs help and the potential victim unless we reintroduce, at least at times, this word into the vocabulary. Just to give one example, if we know there...
We're running tight on the break here. So.
Yes. So if we know of an individual who is putting animals regularly in the dryer and being joyful over the demise of the animal, I'm sorry, this is not normal, and many times this is an indication of trouble ahead.
Thank you, Bill. And we'll be back in just a moment. When we come back from the break, we'll talk about the debate over gun control. Stay tuned.
Great having you.
Incredible women.
I wish they had those kind of cool careers for women when we were growing up.
So in this flashback, we're all the same age?
Yeah.
What does everyone want to be when they grow up?
If I say 2 jobs, do I get extra credit?
No.
I want to make immersive video games.
I want to revolutionize 3D printing.
I want to analyze data from the cloud.
I want to be a meteor.
You mean meteorologist?
No.
That's great, Al. Follow your dreams.
For the record, I was a baby in the 70s.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. William Jeynes, and we're talking about reducing school shootings. Bill, before we went to the break, you were talking about identifiable sociopathic or even psychopathic, or what we would call psychotic behavior by adolescents or teenagers, and these things should not be ignored. They need to be noted, documented, and the proper authorities need to look into this. And we know, for example, in the cases of Columbine High in Colorado and Parkland High School in Florida, that these shooters were well known to have violent tendencies, certainly to make violent threats. They threatened the students, other students, with actually killing them. And they didn't just say this under their breath. They were broadcasting this pretty loudly, and many people knew about it. Law enforcement had encountered or been engaged with these eventual shooters, and yet law enforcement did very little to stop them when it was well known what their intentions were. Have we become wiser now as a result of these particular incidents? And what can law enforcement do to be more assertive based on the example you gave earlier of cruelty to animals and things of that nature? What can law enforcement do that they haven't done up to now?
Well, that's a mouthful of a question, but just to choose certain portions of it, in terms of have we learned, I think to some degree, but we need to learn more. And I think we need to be more open-minded because we have these two extremes often in the debate on reducing school shootings. We have people who will only talk about gun control, and then we have other people who will talk about everything else except gun control. And we need to come together and realize again that we need a comprehensive approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that leads into the gun control debate, and a lot of people started focusing on gun control as these shootings kept coming and saying we just need more gun control. And that's sort of the emotional knee-jerk reaction to all of these incidents, but we're finding that so far we haven't gotten anywhere with that. So also I would say there are two problems with that. One is that a lot of these students are not going out and buying guns. A lot of them are either borrowing them or stealing them from their parents, or borrowing them from older friends that acquired these guns. And so if you pass a number of background check laws, those won't apply in those cases. Also, as you point out in the book, background checks aren't always that effective with adolescents and teenagers because they don't have a track record
of
doing the kinds of things that would end up on a criminal background check. So that being the case, where can we go with this gun control debate in a way that's a reasonable place to start and also have some results or a solution that might actually bear fruit without violating the Second Amendment?
Right, and everything you just said is totally accurate. I think what is very important for the audience to understand is that in order to reduce these school shootings, we need an intelligent set of gun control guidelines and laws specific for the schools. I mean, a lot of things such as background checks, and other strategies might well work and probably do work for the overall adult population. But most of these school shooters, not all of them, but most of them are between the ages of 11 and 18. And as you mentioned, they don't have a background. So if we really want to reduce these, we need to start with a different approach that is geared towards the youth. And certainly one thing I would recommend that isn't recommended hardly at all is having smart guns. In fact, this is one of the strategies that has the potential of appealing to both sides of this debate. Okay, you still have some access to guns, but the idea is it might be a gun that recognizes your fingerprint. You may need a password. I mean, there are a number of different approaches, but it gives the ability of people to defend themselves, but keeps the shooters away from using their parents' guns, etc.
And as you point out in the book, it's not just about guns. This is about violent behavior. This is about the desire to kill, maim, and destroy, frankly. And there are other countries. We tend to think that America is the only country that has this problem. It's not true. There are countries that have very effectively banned guns, such as China. And China has experienced a series of grisly school attacks where the perpetrators use knives or hatchets or other kinds of devices. Also, it's worth noting that there are a number of these school shootings where the shooters intended to use bombs, such as in Columbine High. They brought 2 propane bombs that they had intended to detonate in the cafeteria, which would have murdered over 500 people instead of the 13 that were murdered by guns. So if we focus only on guns, we're missing the larger point here, which is about dysfunctional families, trauma, and people with violence on their mind.
Very true. In fact, in China, they've had attacks using propane gas, using gasoline, setting fire to school buses that in one case injured 65 people and killed, many more. I think it was, 12, 15, something like that. So we need to be very cautious because increasingly, especially with information that's available on the internet, it's sad, but want to build a bomb, just look hard enough on the internet and they'll instruct you. In fact, Harris from the Columbine attack said if he had known more about bombing, he would have flown a plane into New York City. This is before 9/11, mind you. He would have crashed a plane into New York City, and it's like, wait a minute, this was a few years before 9/11, and he was saying this. So yeah, these are some of the ways these minds work.
Right, and so we really have to address the mental instability aspect of this. That's really critical. All right, well, let's move on to some of the other conclusions you came to and some of the directives that you offer or suggestions. And that has to do with the responsibility of media, of Hollywood, and violent video games. So let's start, we'll address all 3 of those. Let's start with media, meaning news media, and particularly television. Television has, of course, a reputation of always going for the most violent, most sensational stories. And as a former news reporter myself, I know that the slogan in the newsroom was, if it bleeds, it leads. That means the more violent the story, the higher it goes to the top of the order of the news for that night. And so a lead story is the first story. So how can television news do a better job of serving the public?
Well, I think one thing it would be nice for them to do is focus more on the positive. And I know it's hard to find something positive in a school shooting, but there are a lot of heroes out there. At West Paducah, Kentucky, there was a minister's son who approached the shooter and said, hey, come on, man, don't do this. Let's stop right here. There was another case where there was a wrestler, who risked his life to save others and jumped on the shooter. There was also, there have been teachers. There's one, Soto, who actually shielded the students, put her own body in front of them so that she would be shot and not the students, and put others in closets. And yet we don't hear that much about these people.
What about the notoriety that these individuals seem to crave, the shooters? Are we doing a disservice by giving so much publicity to the shooters and offering their names and such?
I think we are. I praise some broadcasters, some news broadcasters, who will refer to the shooter in a way that does not reveal the identity of the shooter so that there isn't so much publicity, because we need to realize that even overseas in places like South America and Brazil and in Russia, sometimes they glamorize, especially the Columbine shooting, view it as a holiday and actually try to have similar shootings on the precise same day that there was the Columbine shooting. So there clearly are these copycat effects.
Right, and so continuing with the focus on Hollywood, the media, and video games, let's go to Hollywood. Hollywood, of course, does specialize in these very violent movies that involve guns and shootouts as the solution to problems and the way to take revenge and so forth. So I know producers have a First Amendment right to produce violent movies. That's understood. But what about the movies that tend to inspire these copycat killers? Should we really think about that, and should there be pressure on Hollywood to not make those kinds of movies? And how, as consumers, can we have an impact on that?
Absolutely, whether it is books or videos by Pearl Jam that influenced the Moses Lake shooter, also the Moses Lake shooter, and notice I'm not mentioning the name of the shooter. The Moses Lake shooter actually quoted Rage, and there was a line in Rage. It was about a school shooting, and there's a line in Rage that says, "This sure beats algebra, doesn't it?" And that was actually quoted by the shooter. So it's very clear that Hollywood is affecting this problem, and the Hollywood needs to act more responsibly. A lot of people in Hollywood, part of it's maybe the culture, they can do whatever they want. I remember the main actor in Mannix, was asked, how did you keep your marriage together for so many years? And he said, we lived outside of Hollywood.
So continuing on with this theme, violent video games. There's been a number of studies about violent video games, and I think we all assume that it kind of creates a cultural tolerance for this kind of overt violence. Is that true? Is that held up by the studies?
Yes, there haven't been that many studies done, but I think that you really do get a sense that, especially when usually they're teens in these video games, not always, and it's kind of like them against us. And suddenly it's okay, or it can become okay unconsciously, to eliminate the enemy, and we lose compassion for other groups of people, both within this country and outside of this country, and I don't think that's a good thing.
You know, Bill, we've only got about 30 seconds left for the show, so I'm going to give you the last word. Are you seeing any hopeful signs in this process of trying to reduce school shootings?
Well, I am hopeful in many respects, because this idea that's come from this data analysis, and I think it helps, this is a meta-analysis, that we need a comprehensive approach. It really is being embraced by a lot of people, especially in the media and government, and so I'm encouraged.
Thank you, Bill. The book is Reducing School Shootings. My guest today is the author of that book, Dr. William Jeynes. Thanks again, Bill. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.